travel is become an issue. The rest of the states, when you, by definition, if you're third lowest, it means if anyone comes in from any state, they pose a threat. As New York has been doing better than most states, we've been dealing with this for a while. We came up with a state quarantine policy. Probably the first time the state has ever done that in history. There's no such thing really as a state quarantine policy. But state quarantine policy, and we had a list, and we started to add states to the list when they hit certain metrics. And the list started small, and then the list got longer and longer and longer and longer. At one point, it was no longer a list. It was almost all-inclusive. So now you don't have a list because it's all-inclusive. Just to torture the analogy. Let's say I had a list of reporters who I didn't like to deal with. So then I had one reporter, then I had two reporters on the list, then I had three reporters on the list. And it got to a point where I had every reporter on the list. It's no longer a list. Now it becomes, I don't want to deal with any member of the press. So you have to come up with a new plan. We have to come up with a new policy for quarantine. And I said last week that we were working with global health experts on a new policy. So we're going to a new plan. Given the changing facts, we're coming up with a new program. And all the experts suggest we shift to a testing policy. And that's what we're going to do. And this is how it will work. There'll be no quarantine list. There will be no metrics. There'll be one rule that applies across the country. And the rule is this. If you are coming to the state of New York, within 3 days of arriving in New York, you must have tested negative and have proof of a test within 3 days upon your arrival in New York that says you're negative. Once you arrive in New York, you must quarantine for 3 days and then can take a test on the 4th day. And if the test on the 4th day says you are negative, then, God bless, you're released from quarantine. If the test says you're positive, then you remain in quarantine. If you choose not to get tested, then you remain in quarantine for the 14-day period. But I don't know why anybody would do that. So the mandatory quarantine is actually 3 days upon arrival. You can take a test on the 4th day. Test says you're negative. That's that. So you will have had a test within 3 days of arrival that said you're negative. A test 4 days after arrival that says you're negative. 4 days plus 3 days is 7 days, and that's basically the, by all probability, the incubation period, and that's the policy. It applies to every state except the contiguous states for the reasons we've discussed. The caveat is this. New Yorkers who travel outside of New York for less than 24 hours must take a test within 4 days of their arrival. If the test says they're positive, then we go into contact tracing mode, etc., quarantine. But they must take a test within 4 days upon arrival. They do not need to take a test before getting on the plane to come back to New York. That's the policy, and the list and the metrics are no longer applicable.